Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, two former army barracks, Napier and Penally, have been under scrutiny since they opened to asylum seekers last year. Cramped conditions, demonstrations outside, fires and disruption inside, and then an outbreak of COVID affecting almost 200 people. This programme, along with the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, has obtained documents under Freedom of Information which show that, among other things, the government was aware of the health risks of housing people in this way. The Home Secretary insisted the barracks should be good enough for asylum seekers, as required by the law, because they were good enough for military personnel. But were they? Porrick O'Brien reports.
September last year, the Home Office moved hundreds of asylum seekers into two army barracks, Napier in Kent, Penally in South Wales, which the Home Secretary deemed was suitable for them because, she said, it had been suitable for the military. It was a challenging month for the government. Record numbers of people arrived in small boats that summer. Alongside that, a second wave of coronavirus.
Infections are up. Hospital admissions are climbing.
No sooner had the repurposed barracks opened than things started to go pear-shaped. Demonstrations started taking place almost immediately outside the camps. The first COVID outbreak inside. At one point, almost 200 COVID-positive cases. In January, residents trashed the canteen at Napier and a fire was started. The question, could the Home Secretary have seen any of it coming? Working with the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, we've obtained documents used by the Home Office to assess the suitability of both sites. The reports conclude that the accommodation was viable, although in a poor state of repair, but classifies the dormitory-style accommodation during a pandemic as a risk. Just a few weeks after it opened in September, we were reporting on a pro-migrant demonstration outside Napier. On the same day, the first COVID outbreak was reported there. But worse was to come. Just today, it was revealed that a branch of the NHS visited Napier in January and concluded that there are too many people housed in each block to allow adequate social distancing and to prevent the risk of a spread of infection. It also highlighted the reluctance of some residents to get tested. We've also obtained correspondence in which a Home Office official is relaying advice from Public Health England to his superiors about Napier. Their advice, the official says, is that dormitories are not suitable. But if we must use them, we must have a minimum of 2 metres between each bed. The official goes on to say we need to make sure we have facilities to enable completion of the 14-day quarantine period. This could be tricky. And it was. At a recent Home Affairs Select Committee, shock and awe when the Home Office's top civil servant revealed the extent of the latest COVID outbreak at Napier in January.
In total, in January, there were 178 positive tests and 19 in February, leading to a total of 197 between the start of January and now.
Oh my God, you had 178 cases?
Under international law, the government is obliged to offer asylum, and the Home Office told us today that it's meeting its statutory obligation to provide asylum seekers with accommodation. They also said that the government have been following public health advice in relation to the barracks. The Home Secretary has put the outbreak down to asylum seekers not socially distancing. In her evidence to committee, she said that if the accommodation in the barracks was good enough for servicemen and women, it was good enough for asylum seekers.
This military accommodation that has housed our servicemen and women, and it's housed servicemen and women recently.
If you would put the military personnel there now, then it's you that's insulting our servicemen, not folk who criticise it. It's
not at all.
But was it good enough for military personnel? Penally, for example, was being used by the MOD for short stays during training exercises. The documents we've obtained point out that these cabins, Nissen huts, quote, aren't used by the MOD during the winter due to the challenges of heating them, so not suitable for military personnel at the time. These pictures obtained by the Bureau of Investigative Journalism suggest that the huts were being used, at least for a time, for asylum seekers. The Home Office told us today that Penally has since had a full renovation of its heating system. Now, there is a perspective that says, well, it's not ideal, but it's a damn sight better than what these men are used to. And indeed, another official document in September states that housing asylum seekers in more generous accommodation would undermine public confidence in the asylum system. So, to the communities in which the barracks are based. When it comes to Napier, for example, under the heading Any Known Sensitivities, the documents we've seen warn that the area has a strong right-wing presence. For Penally, the report highlights the likely concerns raised by what is already a vocal community. In other words, the Home Office had been warned of the possibility of a certain amount of disquiet locally when it came to placing that number of asylum seekers just outside the village. So you might have assumed that they would have gone the extra mile in terms of engaging with people and giving them reassurances locally. If you have assumed that, unfortunately, you would have been wrong. We asked this councillor, when did local politicians first hear about the Penally camp opening for asylum seekers?
It's bypassed Welsh Government, it's bypassed the local authority, it bypassed me, it bypassed the community and the community council.
Like, when did you hear about it?
I heard about it on the Friday afternoon before the Monday when the first asylum seekers arrived at Penally camp.
The Home Office did not address these points in their response to us today. This man has been at Penally for months now, one of about 50 people now left there. Similar numbers are at Napier after the COVID outbreak. He's asked for anonymity, worried that it could affect his asylum claim. He's not complaining about the accommodation per se, but says he knows what conflict looks like. And it looks like an army barracks.
The point is psychological and mental problems. It can easily traumatize all of these people. Security guards, with gates, wires, fences.
He tells us he's a student of politics. For him, that is what the determination to keep the barracks open is all about.
Porrick O'Brien, well, while we're on the Home Office, its former top civil servant has settled his employment tribunal claim after he launched legal action against the Home Secretary Priti Patel. It's understood he received £340,000 plus legal costs. Sir Philip Rutnam had accused Ms Patel of a vicious and orchestrated briefing campaign against him. He resigned from his post last year amid allegations that she had bullied staff. The government said it was pleased the settlement had been reached, but it did not accept liability. Well, earlier I spoke to the chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, the Labour MP Yvette Cooper, and I started by asking her what should have happened when it came to housing asylum seekers.
Well, I think it's just shocking that the Home Office ever thought that putting so many people in a dormitory in the middle of a pandemic was a good idea. And it's unsurprising and awful that there's been such a big outbreak of COVID at Napier Barracks, but it really should have been obvious to everyone involved that it was the wrong thing to do to have people in these kinds of conditions. It clearly wasn't COVID safe.
The Home Office's response seems to be, if it's good enough for soldiers, it's good enough for asylum seekers.
But it clearly wasn't in the middle of a pandemic. It clearly wasn't appropriate to put so many people into dormitory accommodation. And we've also seen, by the look of it, that it was inappropriate accommodation for staff who were also sleeping 3 people to a room. And to have such a substantial outbreak in the barracks just shows that the accommodation arrangements were not compliant with the kinds of things that we would expect to happen in the middle of a pandemic.
But do you think taxpayers should be paying for asylum seekers to stay in hotels?
We have to have a system that makes sure that we support people and have a proper process for people who are fleeing from persecution. That's what the UK has always done. We've always had a tradition of helping people who have fled conflict, persecution, or terrible things happening. And there has to be a system in place to make sure that that is done fairly and that each individual claim is properly fairly checked. But the problem we've got at the moment is there is such a huge backlog in deciding these cases that as a result the Home Office doesn't have the accommodation in place. The simplest thing they should do is actually bring the backlog down.
What do you make of Priti Patel's attitude towards this? Is she more in tune perhaps with public opinion?
I actually don't think it is in keeping with public opinion to put people in dormitory accommodation in the middle of a pandemic. You know, to have a situation where the people who were the asylum seekers in the accommodation, but also the staff in the accommodation, people who were working in the local community would be affected by this. I just think, to be honest, I think that is the view of the majority of people across the country. Put basic provisions in place to make sure that people don't get COVID.
It's also been revealed today that the government has settled the employment tribunal with the former permanent secretary, Sir Philip Rutnam. The figure being talked about is about £370,000, including legal fees. What do you think of that?
Well, this clearly is a real concern, because for us to reach a point where the relationships at the top of the Home Office had obviously become so dysfunctional, that for a major department of state, I think is very serious. And so obviously when there's been settlement in the employment tribunal, it's very hard to see what the details are behind that. But I think it does raise wider concerns about the functioning of the Home Office as an institution. And it's really important that you have an effective working culture, that you can have ministers and civil servants able to work effectively together. Things clearly went very badly wrong in this case, and it's really important that that is put right.
Yvette Cooper, thank you very much.